Welcome to CLESTalk, Law for Sustainable Cities, a podcast that focuses on cities, law and environmental sustainability. In this podcast, we venture into legal scholarship and research on sustainable urban development in South Africa, the broader African region and beyond. During this series, we will feature special guests and also host our own CLES researchers. As you know, CLES is a research chair under National Research Foundation's Research Chair Initiative and operates under the Faculty of Law at the Northwest University. Today's episode is a collaborative effort between CLES and the Environmental Law Association of South Africa, or the ELA as affectionately known, in celebration of National Water Week that took place during the 22nd to the 25th March 2022. So for this special episode, I'm your host, John Rantlo, a postdoctoral fellow at CLES and the Northwest representative of the Environmental Law Association. Our episode is themed Groundwater Management and the Law in South African Urban Areas. We have two guests in the CLES studio with us today. Our first guest is Mr. Thapelo Mongala. Mr. Mongala is based at the Center of Water Science and Management at the Northwest University, and his research focuses on groundwater management. So, Mr. Mongala, welcome to today's episode of CLESTalk. It is an absolute pleasure to have this discussion with you and looking forward to having an enriching discussion with you. So to start off, can you give us a short introduction of your work on groundwater management?
Thank you, John, for the invitation, and good afternoon to your listeners. So for a bit of background on myself and my work with groundwater management, I'm from the Center for Water Science and Management, like you mentioned. My thesis for my MSc focused on the development of an online database to engage in citizen science. It's based on boreholes. My previous employment was with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, where I served in a project technical committee for integrated waste management plans for local municipalities. I gave inputs on the spread of leachate to groundwater resources in municipal landfills.
Wow, that is interesting. Could you briefly explain what groundwater refers to?
So groundwater is water that's situated below the surface. We call it subsurface water, and it's in the saturated zone. That is, the saturated zone is the area of underground where water fills all the pores, the voids, the fissures that are underground. And then the limit of the saturated zone we call the water table. So that's what groundwater is, and it's quite important in the water cycle because from the surface water seeping into our groundwater also feeds surface water through streams and rivers, through gradients in pressure and gravity.
That's interesting. So the theme of the National Water Week was groundwater, making the invisible visible. So data plays a big role in making groundwater more visible. And with this in mind, what are some of the challenges in groundwater data and its management?
I'll mention three key challenges. The first one is data collection of groundwater is quite expensive. You need skills, equipment, expertise to understand the groundwater resource through exploration and development. So that's quite an expensive challenge. The other issue is that the disclosure of groundwater data is quite challenging because people keep groundwater data to themselves, especially private industry. It's not like with government where we have two central databases. The national one is the National Groundwater Archive. The regional one we call the Groundwater Resource Information Project, which is based in Limpopo. These are our major databases, but we have challenges with them because the data within these databases is variable and incomplete. So for example, you might find that you're looking at a borehole that was last captured, its information was last captured in maybe 1930. Yeah, it serves little purpose to us now because we need to assess our groundwater right now. Then the last one is the sharing of groundwater information needs to be engaging citizens. So that's a challenge because many groundwater users aren't just from industry. Private citizens also have boreholes. I think we realized through day zero in Cape Town that a lot of people tend to groundwater in such situations when dam levels were low. So a lot of people developed boreholes, and that type of information wasn't captured. So we need to find a way of addressing such challenges.
So, Mr. Thapelo, in view of these challenges that you just highlighted now, which I believe there are more than this, how, in your opinion, can these challenges be addressed? And do you think the cities in particular can play a role in this regard?
These challenges can be addressed through a variety of ways, but I'll only focus on the most crucial at the moment. I think the first one would be the developing legislation that will confine or force borehole drillers to be registered so that they can provide us with groundwater information and where they're drilling. Because quite often anyone that has a borehole can just advertise and go and drill wherever without actually analyzing properties of the groundwater, the aquifer, and sustainable pumping. So that's quite a big issue. Another one is to incentivize our citizens to disclose information. A project that's currently underway at the Center for Water Science and Management is the development of a groundwater app where average citizens can take their smartphones and collect data on boreholes that they have at home. So this helps us to understand the groundwater resource, but it also helps them by allowing us to give them recommendations on sustainable pumping and things like that. So it goes both ways. In terms of cities, because this becomes now a local government issue, the challenge there is capacity, skills, expertise, and people that are there. Quite often what we see now is that cities like Cape Town are moving to groundwater. The city of Cape Town is having an agreement with French partners to develop their groundwater infrastructure. And for those types of things, you should have the skills in place. So your technicians, your pump operators, your hydrologists should be involved in that. And those people should be skilled. And also not just on the technical side, but also on the political side, engaging our ward councillors on being aware, just giving them education and awareness on groundwater resources and how they should be used sustainably will give them a better picture, because they're the ones that develop the policies and they're the ones that allocate the resources in local government for these types of projects. So it's very important that we engage them as well so that they have a nice picture of what's going on.
Thank you so much. So in your previous answer, you mentioned water quality. So can you elaborate on how water quality monitoring features into securing access to safe water, and can you suggest any best practices in this regard?
Okay, for us to manage our groundwater resource, monitoring is a key component, but firstly we have to know what we have to monitor. I'll use an example of the landfill, like I mentioned before. Because that activity generates a lot of leachate. Leachate is contaminants that are generated maybe from your hazardous or general waste that seeps into your groundwater. You might implement observation boreholes close to those sources of leachate so that you use them to monitor your groundwater at regular intervals, depending on the quality of your aquifer, its characteristics, like how fast water moves underground. We call that hydraulic conductivity. So yeah, you measure those types of things and they give you a nice picture of how to analyze.
Okay, so as our last question, one of the biggest challenges we are facing now is climate change. So what are the effects of climate change on South Africa's groundwater resources?
Okay, climate change, we might consider it as a twofold problem in terms of groundwater. Mm-hmm. It's a quality problem and a quantity problem. It's a quantity problem in that we know that climate change is going to bring about more increased droughts for longer periods. And when that happens, many communities are going to start turning to groundwater. And if there's no sustainable use of our groundwater resource, we're going to find ourselves having it being depleted and not having enough time for it to recharge to a sustainable level. In terms of a quality factor, I think we understand that with rising sea levels, our coastal aquifers are going to have greater saltwater intrusions. And it becomes a problem because our groundwater is a freshwater resource. And having it become saline, it becomes quite difficult to extract salt from that groundwater. It's a tedious process. It's very expensive and it takes a lot of specialized equipment. So we need to consider those types of aspects.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Mongala, for being here with us. I've truly learned a lot, and I believe our listeners have also learned a lot. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our second guest is Professor Germarié Viljoen, an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the Northwest University, and her research is on the concept of trusteeship and water law. Professor Germarié is also on the EXCO of the ELA. It is an absolute pleasure to have you as well, and I'm looking forward to an enriching discussion on groundwater management and the law. So on that note, can you give us a brief introduction of your work on groundwater management and the law?
Dr. Rantlo, yes. For a decade now, I've been working on legal or statutory interpretation issues arising from the National Water Act of 1998. And my research, time and time again, confirmed the threat of water scarcity in our country, which is officially ranked as the 30th driest country in the world. So in securing access to water, more and more South African cities increasingly rely on groundwater. Just to give you a bit of context, perhaps, in 2011, the Department of Water Affairs reported that groundwater was the sole and primary source of water for 926 cities, or towns and villages in South Africa. But since then, a drastic increase in groundwater dependence has been reported. And not only for urban domestic purposes, but also for other socio-economic purposes, such as agriculture and mining, for example. Obviously, these developments bring with it instances of exploitation and even pollution. Perhaps you can recall the serious outbreaks of waterborne diseases in the Delmas area in 2005 due to groundwater contamination. You will remember that more than 3,000 people were diagnosed with serious waterborne diseases, with a number of people even losing their lives because of it. So these facts prompted my interest in the field of groundwater. As a lawyer, I'm working from a legal and governance perspective, of course, to evaluate the effectiveness of South Africa's existing groundwater regulatory framework, and also to explore opportunities to strengthen the existing groundwater governance framework. In sum, the ultimate aim of my work is to increasingly ensure the legal protection of South Africa's aquifers that host our groundwater resources.
Thank you so much. And that sounds very interesting, and it ties well with what Mr. Mongala has indicated in some of his answers. Are there currently any interesting developments concerning the law on groundwater management?
Yes. You know, if you read the National Water Act, you'll realize that groundwater governance is not really strongly emphasized in the Act. With this in mind, Karen Bosman and I have been working on some ideas to elevate the prominence of groundwater protection in the existing water law framework. You will know or recognize Karen as one of the leading South African professionals in water governance. As Karen and I have been working on some new ideas, we came across interesting and relevant developments. One of these is the utilization of planning law and what we call groundwater protection zoning to protect South Africa's aquifers. Elements hereof have in actual fact recently been incorporated by the City of Cape Town. I think at this stage it is perhaps best to invite you to read our forthcoming publication on the feasibility of aquifer zoning in South Africa.
Definitely, we are going to read it. And it seems like Cape Town is doing fairly well when it comes to the issues of groundwater management. And yeah, we'll definitely look out for your paper. Moving on, according to the Water Research Commission, groundwater is underutilized for domestic supply in urban areas, where it is generally being misused or at least indirectly used in a negative consequences. So what are your views on this?
This is indeed a pressing question, and there are many views on this matter. I think when one talks about the underutilization of groundwater, it is useful to briefly consider past developments. You know, generally, as urban areas or towns are being established, water supply generally comes from local resources, or at least this was the case for Johannesburg and Cape Town, for example. In both these areas, the population was initially supplied by local groundwater and other surface water resources. But as these cities continued to grow, authorities started to import water from other sources, or further sources, and thereby replacing the local sources. This tendency towards the, let's call it, centralization of water supply, therefore had, or shall we say has, a direct impact on the underutilization of local groundwater resources. You also asked about the misuse or indirect uses of groundwater that might have negative consequences. Here, many aspects come to mind. I'm thinking about the many sealed and hard surfaces in urban areas. These, of course, prevent water from infiltrating the ground surface, and naturally this prevents groundwater recharge. We must also consider the groundwater quality impacts from leaking sewer works, or underground storage tanks of petrol stations, or cemeteries, or nitrate from fertilizers that's mobilized by water gardening, to name just a few.
Thank you so much, Prof. So moving to the next question, how, if at all, do you think the law could address this issue to ensure access to sufficient water for people in urban areas?
Dr. Rantlo, to answer or meaningfully contribute to the discourse presented by this question, one must have a general water law understanding. As you know, there are three principal sources of national water legislation in South Africa. These are, of course, the Constitution and also the National Water Act 36 of 1998 and the Water Services Act 108 of 1997. Remember, sections 24 and 27 of the Constitution grant specific rights of access to sufficient water and an environment that is not harmful to health or well-being. And it also provides for the protection of the environment from degradation. So, wary of an oversimplified explanation, it is safe to say that the Constitution, with the National Water Act and the Water Services Act, dictate the duties and responsibilities of water services providers. So with this in mind, the question, of course, remains whether the law provides some interventions for improved water services delivery. Yes, it does. I can name a few interventions that can have an impact on the delivery of access to sufficient water. The first call would probably be to directly challenge the constitutional water right. But if so, one must take note of recent case law. The well-known Mazibuko cases, for example, suggested that the role of the courts in interpreting social and economic rights is not to determine precisely what the achievement of such a right would entail. But the court in Mazibuko rather adopted an approach that acknowledges the obligation of the state to respond to the basic needs of our people by adopting reasonable legislation. Secondly, or alternatively rather, it may be useful to consider an administrative law approach. This may be followed, of course, for the implementation of the statutory framework for water services. Then litigation by civil society is also an option. Litigation in this context may take the form of court actions for interdicts, seeking to correct or revert certain activities by a certain sphere of government. And remember, some concerns of service delivery may even be resolved through improved cooperative governance or other forms of pressures towards accountability. An important tool here would be the principle of public participation, which of course ensures public involvement and public accountability in decision-making processes.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that insightful information. And now to wrap up this session, I just quickly want to ask you the last question. So if you could change two things about the legal framework on groundwater management, what would they be?
I would think that as a minimum, groundwater should enjoy much more prominence in our water legislation. While the National Water Act provided an ideal opportunity for the judicious governance of South Africa's groundwater resources, it remained rather vague when it comes to groundwater governance. And secondly, I would continue to argue with my learned friend Karen Bosman to formally introduce the notion of aquifer protection zoning into our control mechanisms.
That is a wrap from us. So thank you very much, Mr. Mongala and Prof. Viljoen, for joining us today for this collaborative episode and for the enlightening discussion. So I have learned quite a lot on groundwater management, both from the perspective of science and the legal perspective, particularly in urban areas. And I'm certain our listeners have as well. Remember to like, follow, share, and subscribe, and also interact with us and our guests on CLES and ELA social media. Thank you for listening to CLESTalk, Law for Sustainable Cities, and look out for our next podcast soon.